Content warning: torture and suicidality. Chapter 25. Deathless. The place where Kendra awoke was dreadfully dark, but she felt almost as if a blinding light was searing into her. It took a moment for her to realize, hazy and disconcerted, that it was not from her eyes, but from her hands. With lids raising ever so slightly, she looked and shuddered. Her arms had been spread wide, her palms up in a gesture of supplication, and through each palm a thick pike of reddish metal stood tall, crucifying her. As she swayed, Kendra could feel it scraping against her shattered bones, and she vomited, hacking up what little was inside her. Even through the pain and the choking sick on her tongue, she was reminded vividly of the gaze of the face stealer, the sensation of being pinned up for display. And, as if summoned by the thought, she saw it. Crouching beside a curiously muted fire, it watched her. Thomas's features, distended and cold as they'd never been in life, now had a sort of detached glee to them. The grin had eased into a smile that was almost gentle, but it was those eyes that held her, no longer hollow. Now they glittered with a cold satisfaction. It crossed to her, its movements still staccato, a puppet on strings, but with a look of purposeful study about it. It reached out, and Kendra flinched, but its touch brought no fresh pain. It merely prodded her roughly, evaluating something, its eyes flickering unknowably. Then it twitched in what might have been a shrug. Not ripe. Not yet. And it began to tear at her. There was very little Kendra could say for certain about what followed. Horrors flowed together into a tapestry of screams and agony. She felt bones crack and skin rip, saw clawed hands tear into her belly and move around exploratively, violating her insides, tugging at her guts and caressing her organs. Kendra felt death come again and again, and yet again and again felt it denied to her, no matter how much she begged. And always, as she returned from the darkness, she was greeted with those fathomless, staring eyes. Reality began to slip and slur at the edges. Sometimes she saw things, phantasms of other times and places. For a while, Auntie Iris stood in the corner of the cave, watching her with a look of bitter disappointment. She flinched as she saw the mutilated corpses splayed in a heap at her feet. Caleb, Maya, Adrian. And once it was Moira that was peeling away her face in bloody sheets, Moira that ate her skin with that expression of ecstasy. Each time she felt her body break anew, she could not help but feel that her mind too must snap in the end. It could only be a matter of time. But something held her back from the edge. At first she had dismissed it as one of the passing hallucinations pulling at her fraying mind. There was a sense of another presence, unplaceable but near, cool and unshakable. But as she passed from one hell into the next, and her mind quavered under the splitting weight of it all, that presence remained, solid and certain. It stood like a lone lighthouse over churning seas, a regal beacon in the tossing darkness. It was not happy or welcoming, but Kendra became ever more sure that it was real, even as doubt crept over everything else. As each torment ended and a new one was prepared, she heard the voice. There will come a moment to slip from the hunter's snare. Be ready. And for another turn of the wheel, she held on. She was returning to full consciousness once more, her body half-healed from what had last been inflicted on her. Precisely what that might have been, she could not rightly say. The order of events was difficult to keep straight now. There was only her and the face-stealer, its eternal stare ever near and unblinking, and Kendra looked away, her throat quivering. It was then that something new caught her eye. There was a shaft of light passing through a crack in the ceiling. She stared at the impossibility. Another hallucination? But in the time she had been here, there had never once been a vision of anything good, anything remotely hopeful. Echoing in her mind, she heard those words again. Be ready. And sluggishly, some part of her obeyed, pulling herself off her knees with a dreadful effort. The roof of the cave exploded. Light flooded into the room, impossibly bright. There was a terrible rumbling above, and all around them rocks fell like hail. But through the din and the tumult, Kendra saw them. 4 figures stood in the whiteness of the light. 2 were carven standing stones, and a third was a beast, lean and furious. Finally, at their head, a 4th figure stood, and as Kendra beheld him, she was sure that she had at last died or gone truly mad, for what else could he be but an angel? Broad wings were spread low across the floor of the cavern, quivering with power, and he was crowned in the sun's own radiance. She might have remained there for a long time, gaping at this new vision. But the voice came to her again, or maybe it was her own voice? She was not sure she could tell the difference any more, but it hardly mattered. Kendra felt an unfamiliar sensation rising in her, something like purest instinct, as if she tapped into something fundamental within herself that had always been there, hiding. Step from the hunter's snare, she whispered. Even if it were to deliver herself into the arms of that angel of death, Kendra knew there was nothing she would not do to escape. And so she began to pull her hands free. She felt the screaming resistance of her flesh, but agony was no stranger now. A roar tore from her throat, and she ripped her ruined hands from the spikes that had impaled them. The face-stealer was turning to the sound, and Kendra shut her eyes. She could not bear the weight of that terrible visage for any longer, could not let herself falter. With a leap from legs coiled to their limit, Kendra surged past in a blur. She heard stones falling everywhere, and strong, gentle arms encircled her. Then the sensation of soaring. I'm dead, she thought, absolute relief coursing through her broken body. It's over. The light spiraled to its apex, blinding, before fading rapidly into darkness.